Welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast. This is about connecting industries, technologies, histories, and psychologies to find intersections that can lead to personal and professional growth. Our conversations will be a blend of research, insights, and personal stories, and we hope by listening you become more fascinated about yourself and the world you live in. On behalf of Jay Arjun, this is Arjun Sachdev, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
We want to start the episode today by saying thank you to all of our listeners. We really do appreciate your time and support. And we want to offer special thanks to those of you who have subscribed, be it on YouTube or Apple Podcasts. Hitting that subscribe button really is the single most important thing you can do right now to help us grow Rising Laterally. So we want to offer you a sincere thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the support. And we think today's conversation is going to be a timely one because the thought of becoming a commodity in an era with short attention spans isn't a fun one, but it is one that's crossing a lot of people's minds. If you're like millions, you may be reevaluating what your main hustle is going to be in the future. This is also the time to remaster the ancient art of storytelling. That's how you're going to differentiate yourself. So Jay, let's start with some of the practical uses of storytelling that can be used within industries. Then that could lead us to explore the psychological building blocks of a good story and how our brains are responding during storytelling. And then we can weave in the history of storytelling as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so as Arjun said, we're going to spend a lot of time over the course of this episode really articulating the ubiquity and the utility of stories in human life. But where we want to begin is by offering a little bit of practical guidance around storytelling to add a little value right out of the gate here. So I think most people listening have probably heard of the old real estate mantra, location, location, location. When it comes to storytelling, especially in the commercial context, I think the mantra that we should be drilling into our brains is audience, audience, audience. You know, when I first started out in sales, I was 22 years old. I completely overlooked the importance of the audience. I wanted to talk about my product, my company, my team. I wanted to tell that story, my story, because I had a few dozen pages of collateral that modeled that story pretty well for me. And if I could do it again, I would tell myself that when making a presentation or a pitch, especially in a sales role or in a marketing, whatever it may be, you want to tell a story that puts your client or your investor or your manager at the center of it. I think very often salespeople tell stories that put themselves at the center of it, but that's pretty backwards. You know, if you think all the way back to your mom reading you a bedtime story as a child, was the protagonist of those stories ever a mom? You know, a kid wouldn't want to hear that. Kids want to hear a story about, kids want to hear a story where the protagonist is a child. You think about Where the Wild Things Are, The Giving Tree, James and the Giant Peach, Harry Potter. We have the desire to hear stories about ourselves, and that follows us from childhood all the way to adulthood. So, one of the things we're going to talk about later in the episode is the way that our brains allow us to live vicariously through stories. And the neuroscience is actually suggesting that this vicarious experience is much more profound than we ever realize. It's really a chemical experience. So next time you're making a presentation or a pitch, consider the fact that your audience does not want to vicariously experience your life. They want to vicariously experience the idealized version of their life. So they don't want to hear a story about how great you are or how great you are at what you do. They want to hear a story about how great they could be at what they do. So, when pitching or presenting, you want to position yourself, I think, as a character in the story that will help them get closer to their ideal. And again, we have an instinct when we're client-facing to want to talk about our product, our company, our team, because that's our story. But you have to fight that instinct and instead figure out how you can fold your value add into the story of their goals and their business.
Absolutely. So in your experience, Jay, what type of stories seem to resonate?
Yeah, so I think ultimately all stories follow the same narrative structure. It's about setup, it's about tension, and it's about resolution. And I was actually reading a book called Storytelling in Data that was written by, sorry for forgetting her name here, but I would really like to give her credit because it's a tremendous book. Cole Nussbauer Knaflic. She's a data storytelling guru. And, she was explaining how most people, when they're telling stories through data in the business context, will talk about the problem, then they'll talk about the data, where they got it, what they did with it, what assumptions that they made when they were gathering the data, the statistical analysis, the methodology, and then they'll give some findings or recommendation based on the data. And she was saying, like my previous comments, that's kind of a selfish way of articulating the data or delivering a presentation, because that's based on how you arrived at the data. That's based on your story. But what you really want to do is you want to be able to craft a story with, as I mentioned, that setup, that tension, and that resolution that puts the audience at the heart of the story. So it's not your tension, it's the audience's tension. And, it's not about, she speaks to it in the book, it's not about fabricating tension. If there was no tension, if there was no problem to solve, there wouldn't have been a research project or, a presentation to be made anyway. So it's really about finding the tension that matters to your audience and using that as a way to build credibility and drive them towards the action they need to take.
Yeah, I would say that's one way of using stories. But if you think about sales, for example, there's a story for every part of the sales cycle, from prospecting to building a series of meetings to building rapport, to positioning your insights and then your product. All of those steps require a story. I would argue that some of the best storytellers even know how to handle objections. So, in my opinion, looking back on my experience, some of the things I would tell my rookie sales version, for example, would be to make sure that I had stories, especially as I was developing a series of meetings and as life was happening, sharing those stories. I think the issue in sales for some folks is that, hey, I only have a few seconds. The other person on the other line is not going to want to hear a story. They don't have time for that. So then a lot of time is spent on knowing stories about your own company, your own products, the industry, and competitors. But I would argue that more time could have been spent and should be spent developing stories that could resonate. So again, you may be in situations where you have to have a story of why you do what you do. You may need to have a story about times you've failed or times you've made a mistake, because that could build instant credibility. I also think that you can have a story that separates you from the competition, because if you think about the world that we're in a customer success world. There are so many customer success jobs out there. There's a lot of account executive jobs out there. So it's really becoming like service as a sales environment or sales as a service environment. This is the time to be making sure that you have stories about your happiest clients and how they're using every one of your products that you have to offer, because those are the stories that you can then share with any new clients, and that's how you increase your chance of keeping them. So I would argue that depending on where you are in the cycle, you do need to have stories ready. And this is what's going to give you the chance to stand out. And this is going to give you the chance to position yourself as someone who's valuable. And that's how you're going to continue to gain market share and continue to gain mind share.
Interesting. Really interesting. So could you give an example of a story that may work better in that introductory sales call, or in that situation where you have maybe 30 seconds on the phone, and the type of story you might use after you've known a client for a year or two and you're really trying to deepen that relationship?
In an intro, the story is how you understand that they are going through a problem. I would argue that if you can say, hey, I've had experience working with other types of lawyers or financial advisors, and I know that they're dealing with this, there's a good chance that you're dealing with it as well. If you can weave a story around that, where it shows that you have done it before, where you show that you have experience within the industry, and you're showing that you have some sort of insight, that's the type of story that may get you the intro meeting. Once you start to develop a series of meetings, I think then the stories become a little bit more personal. And if you start to get to know your clients' clients, that might be the best way to tell stories, because let's say you need to position a solution, you can start to use examples of clients that they would know right off of the top of the head that could benefit from it. So let's say you know that a financial advisor has a lot of older clients. Maybe you want to approach them with a story that talks about how expensive healthcare costs are, and how, you know, incomes are not what they used to be and everyone's struggling to find an income solution. Well, I have one for you that can chip away at that medical expense. So if you can start to tell a story in that way, then you're not really spending a lot of time on the actual product. You're talking about them, you're talking about their clients and their client needs, and that might be something that resonates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are certain, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but just because I was talking about that last thing around how stories can help build trust and, you know, relationships. Um, in 1999, the New York Times and CBS, they did a survey, and they asked, okay, of people in general, how many do you think are trustworthy?
Mm.
The average answer was 30%. Then it asked, of the people you know, how many do you think are trustworthy? The average answer shot up to 70%. So it shows that if you know people, the default is trust, but if you don't, then the default is not trusting you. So when you're making that intro call, people are not going to trust you unless you paint a picture or a story of how you've helped other people in their situation.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think storytelling is definitely a really powerful way to express your own values, and a really powerful way to build bonds with other people. So I think doing that not only around the kitchen table with your family, but bringing that social element of storytelling into work can be a pretty powerful utility of storytelling in the business context as well.
Absolutely. Do you know who Paul Smith is?
I don't know. Tell me more.
I would just point our audience to him. He's an organizational storytelling expert and coach. He's got a lot of good advice, some of which I just shared. But if you go to his website, leadwithastory.com, you can get a lot of insight in terms of the types of stories that you would want to have handy depending on where you are in the sales cycle. One other thing I just want to mention, because I think it's pretty awesome to think about, is that if you can tell a good story, then there's a higher chance your clients can tell that story. So pitches usually stay in a room, but stories can travel the world.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think, no one's going to, I was thinking about this. If you're on the phone or sorry, you're talking to a friend and the phone rings, if your friend is walking you through a laundry list of facts, if they're on fact 6 of 10, it's going to be pretty easy to ask them to, hey, give me a second, I have to pick up the phone. If your friend's in the middle of a great story, you're not going to pick up that phone. And to your point, people, I think, are much more willing and excited to share great stories with other people, as opposed to just share novel facts or little factoids that they learned from the wholesaler or the salesperson that came and visited them. Because there is a real sort of entertainment value to stories that isn't there with facts. And even if it's not your story, even if it didn't originate with you, being able to share a story with someone else kind of earns you a little bit of social capital. So to your point, if you can put a great story in front of a client or a manager, whoever it may be, chances are they're going to actually want to share that story with other people, because it's going to make them look good too, especially if they can tell it well. I think, I wanted to kind of also touch on a couple other things that I think make successful stories successful. And I wanted to tie in here some thinking from the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, in the spirit of rising laterally, connecting some thoughts from different disciplines. Have you ever heard of the idea of Chekhov's gun?
No.
Okay, so Anton Chekhov, as I mentioned, was a Russian playwright. He was also a short story writer. He lived in the late 19th century. He was considered to be one of the greatest writers of short fiction in history. He actually wrote over 200 short stories in his 44 short years of life. And I've been trying and failing to write a short story for like 5 years now. So the fact that he was able to get 200 under his belt, it's really, really impressive figure in my book. But anyway, he coined a concept called Chekhov's gun. And the point was that every element of a story should contribute to the whole. It comes from his now infamous writing advice. If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one, it should be fired. So what he's saying there is like, don't introduce an element that's not going to play some pivotal role at the point of resolution or at the point of climax. And you kind of feel that when, a tension is built up in a story and then it takes like an unexpected twist in a way that feels cheap. You kind of feel like that tension was false and the whole story kind of crumbles in light of that unnecessary element. And, while there's probably not going to be a gun involved in your presentation or your pitches, I think the point remains that you want to use, an economy of not only words, but characters and events and so forth. Like try to tell the story with as few elements as possible, because I think that will, increase its brevity, its conciseness, and ultimately its potency.
Yeah, I mean, boiling it down pretty simply, a story is a character or a person that has a goal or a mission and is facing some challenges or obstacles. And then what that character is doing with those obstacles or challenges, or in the face of those obstacles and challenges, that's what the story is all about. So, I mean, those are pretty elementary, basic building blocks for a story. And then that's when you fill in the climax, the conflict, the surprises, the resolution. And you also, in my opinion, need to think about like what's at stake in the story. Is there something minor on the line, or are you telling a story of how you launched a new brand or had, saved your company from a record loss? I mean, what did you do that was at stake in the story? That's pretty important as well.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think stakes are one of the, things that kind of contribute to how memorable a story will ultimately be. If it's a story of like, you almost didn't get the last bag of Cheetos on the counter at the grocery store, that's probably not going to land with anyone. But if it's a story of, saving a relationship, or a story of, if it's in cinema, a story of like saving the world, like we see with the Avengers movies, stakes are, I think, directly tied with the emotional investment that people put into this story. I also think too that, maybe we can talk about it later when we talk about the history of stories throughout human life. But I also think that most great stories also have a moral tilt, and we don't always keep that in mind in business. We're focused so much on the commercial tilt, how something can improve your business. But I think putting that moral spin on stories, and grounding it in something that, may be commercial on the surface, but is tied to something that may be more kind of humanistic in its goal in some way, is another way of really making stories more memorable and more powerful.
Okay, so how would you, handle that when you're trying to design your own professional or personal story?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think if you're, I think you make it in the professional context. I think you make it about the client that, the ultimate end client. So whoever you're selling to, chances are they have a client as well, and they're trying to add value in their own client's life in some way. So I think instead of making it about the way that you're helping your client, you make it about the way their client is helping, their end client. And there's a lot of ways to frame that. Either it's, helping their end client reach retirement, or helping their end client self-actualize their goals, or helping their end client free up time to spend more time with their family. There's a lot of ways, I think, to humanize business success, because, ultimately business success is what allows us to do all those things. It allows us to spend more time with our families. It allows us to potentially retire earlier, or retire with peace of mind that we wouldn't have had otherwise, or, be able to succeed in some pursuit that, we wouldn't have been able to without being enabled by our product partners. So I think instead of making it about like, instead of the end result being and you made $1 million more, and you got the promotion. You just have to tack on that extra piece of like, this is the ultimate human benefit of making that incremental amount of money, or securing that promotion, or whatever it may be.
Right. But what about your own professional story? Like when you're talking about work, I would say you got to do what Simon Sinek says, which is talk about your why. It's not all about, what you do, but if you can tell me why you love to go to work, or if you can tell me why you get excited in the morning, or if you can tell me what it feels like after a good day of work, or if you can tell me how you change someone's life because of your work, then that makes your professional story something that you would want to share with people. So in designing a professional story, those are some things you might want to think about. What you're talking about is in a professional setting, you have to have a client meeting, what types of stories you would share. I was asking what your own professional story would be composed of.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I think you answered the question for me. I think having that why is definitely important, but I think, going back to my initial comments around structure, that's really the thrust of my, I think, position here. Having the setup, having the tension, and having the resolution, I think are vital in constructing any story, your personal story being one of them. So I think a lot of people, in their 20s are probably articulating a story with unresolved tension. I tried sales and I tried marketing and I wasn't really sure what I want to do. So now I'm trying the next thing. I think like everyone's story is going to be different, but finding a way to weave that thread through all the events and, all the events of your professional life, and having that tension come to some resolution, even if it's a little bit manufactured at this point, will leave the person on the receiving end of your story with something that's memorable. I think it's harder to remember a story with resolved tension than it is to remember a story with tension that came to a resolution. When people have the whole arc, they can see the whole picture, then that's something that they can compartmentalize in their mind more easily.
Yeah, it's true, man. Your brain loves stories. Science actually has shown that the same exact brain patterns are taking place in the person telling the story as they are in the brain of the person listening to and understanding your story. So your brain loves stories. You can think about the quadrillion connections that are taking place with all the neurons in your brain. All it wants to do, though, is still find patterns. So it wants to sort through the chaos. It wants to, cut through the noise. And that's why stories are so powerful, because they can actually give your brain some sort of order.
Totally. And I want to talk more about order as we continue the conversation here. I do want to drill down and do a little bit of science that I encountered on the topic of, experiencing the power that imagination has in your brain, and how real the chemical consequences of imagination are. So I was reading David R. Hamilton's blog. He's got a lot of great stuff out there. He's got a PhD in organic chemistry, but he cited a 1995 neuroscience study where volunteers were asked to play a simple sequence of piano notes each day for 5 consecutive days, and their brains were scanned each day in the region connected to those finger muscles. And then another set of volunteers were asked to imagine playing the notes instead, also having their brain scanned. And what they ultimately found were the changes in the brain in those who imagined playing the piano and those who actually played the piano were the exact same relative to the control group, who neither played them nor imagined them and had no changes in their brain. So the way I think that connects to stories is that ultimately your brain, as Dr. Hamilton puts it, cannot really distinguish real from the imaginary. That's why your hair stands up on the back of your neck when you watch Mel Gibson's William Wallace scream freedom at the end of Braveheart, or a tear comes to your eye when Mufasa gets killed by his brother Scar, the Lion King, in front of Simba, or you feel all warm and energized when Vince Vaughn in Wedding Crashers knocks out Bradley Cooper so Owen Wilson can ultimately be with Rachel McAdams. Like, you're not just a passive participant watching those movies or listening to stories. You're really living it with the characters as well, at a chemical level and at a neurological level. So I think a lot of times we think of vicarious living as a sort of like cheap simulacrum of actual experience, but it looks like there's a lot more um, substance there in our brains than we had previously thought.
So if an imagined experience is being processed the same way as a real experience, would you then be willing to argue that stories are the original VR?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think we think of VR as being a headset and just being audio visual, but in some sense, yeah, I think stories are maybe even more powerful than VR is today, in the sense that they kind of usurp your whole body, your whole spirit, your whole mind. I mean, when you're hearing a great story, whether it's, in a movie theater in 2020, or not 2020, but let's say 2019, or you're sitting around a campfire, 2,000 years ago, I think when you're wrapped in that story, it really is an immersive experience, just like VR. So I think that's a really interesting analogy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because your brain literally is on fire when stories are being told. I mean, so many different cortices are being stimulated, and that's really pretty remarkable, because if you hear a good story, you'll usually kind of have that lingering effect. It usually has a good lasting effect on you, and that's because the brain activity can actually last for days. So there's so much mental stimulation, and to your point, it then comes out in a physiological sense, where you can have palms that are sweaty if you're in a story that has something that's frightful or fearful. So it's amazing how much brain activity is actually taking place during a story. And in my opinion, going back to one of your earlier points, if you are in a process of coming up with your own story right now, and maybe you don't have all the experience in the world, well, one thing you can do is understand the psychology of what makes a good story and what's going on in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can reverse engineer your own personal story and then fill it in with the experiences as they come along. And then that might be one way to have an effective story that you can continue to work on, because let's face it, the personal story will never end until it does. So I would just argue that if you can deconstruct or understand the psychology, then you can reverse engineer your own story. As long as you're creating something that can hold my attention, you can transport me into your world, or maybe you can make me learn through your story. I think those elements do need to exist there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think using language to your benefit too, to kind of bring the story to life, using words that sensory details that stimulate the emotional parts of people's brains. Like, when I first got this job, I was as excited as, if I had won the lottery, or using action words like, I really want to drive this point home. You're not actually driving the point anywhere, but people can conceptualize that motion, and those activate parts of the brain that, less abstract language doesn't. So I think punctuating your story with language that stimulates the other parts of the brain is a really powerful way to bring the whole story to life and make it even more memorable.
Yeah, and a good example to start would be your about me section or your bios. I mean, are you writing that you're adventurous, or are you writing a story that describes your last adventure?
Ooh, that's a great point. That's a really great point. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I think, and I think that's kind of where thinking a little bit outside of the box becomes important. We talked in last episode about our sort of instinct to cling to convention, and it's something that we all have as humans. We see social convention and want to imitate it, and it seems like there is a certain way to write the about me section, and we want to stay in that box for fear of like looking stupid or looking silly or looking like we don't understand the convention. But that's one of those situations where it really is it behooves of you to instead focus on the psychology instead of focusing on the convention, because convention doesn't always take advantage of the opportunity there you have to move people. Like, there are these bedrock principles, psychological principles, storytelling or the potency of storytelling being one of them that we should use, even if the convention suggests we shouldn't. So I think you're absolutely right. And my About Me section is not currently a story, so that makes me want to get off this call in a half an hour or so and make an update there.
It's interesting that we keep putting stories in the form of words, but I think one other angle to consider is stories like in the form of a character, or if you can have like a face that can represent a story to spread a message, that might be something that's powerful. I know a personal story would be the Pat Tillman story. Are you familiar with Pat Tillman?
I am, yeah. It's a sad story, but also inspirational story for sure.
Yeah, so you know it, but for some of the folks that may not know it, he was a person that became legendary because, for many reasons, primarily because he quit his football career to join the army after 9/11, simply because he looked around and said, well, hey, everyone in my family fought, including my brother's fighting right now. I haven't done a damn thing. So he suited up, gets in the army, is out there with his brother, and unfortunately in 2004, I think it was, he passed, and in the war. But his legacy continues because of the Pat Tillman Foundation. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because just a few years ago, my buddy told me about this, and San Francisco was holding Pat's Run. So a couple of us got together. We participated in a 4.2-mile race just because that was his jersey number, 42. And again, it's just one of those things. It's a quick story of how you can have a face that tells the story for you and just, can spread the message.
Yeah,
like it's in the form of a character.
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful point. And one thing that I think is important to add on there, people, if you give people a set of facts, they will ultimately create a story out of that anyway. Pamela Rutledge, who's got a PhD in media psychology, writes on Psychology Today, brings up the point that whenever our brains respond to content, we're going to be creating a story to make sense out of that experience anyway. So, with a situation like Pat Tillman, we understand the story intuitively. It hits us on an emotional level. I don't think anyone who hears the story of his life will ever forget it. And I think while all stories may not have the potential to be that inspiring, crafting whatever message you wish to present or whatever series of facts you wish to present in the form of a story, in the form of characters, in the form of events, is what you should be doing, because ultimately the audience will be grasping to make sense of it with a narrative structure anyway. Yeah. And chances are that I guess number one, if they can't find the story in the facts, then they'll just forget them. Or two, if you don't present it as a story, you run the risk of them creating the wrong story in your head and your message not being the one you intended to deliver, the message received not being the one you intended to deliver. So to your point, characters, events, stories, packaging things is stories as much as possible is definitely a winning formula.
Yeah, I mean, like, thinking about it, stories typically do tend to fall in several buckets, anywhere from tragedy to comedy, and anywhere in between there. You can have explorations, you can have quest stories, you can have, going from nothing to something stories, you can have stories where you're defeating evil monsters. I mean, there's really not that many big buckets that stories can fit in. And I find it interesting that no matter how far back you go in history, no matter how old the piece is, these same types of elements are in those types of stories. And what it shows you is that these are what humans are going through. This is what we face on a day-to-day, and then what we end up facing over a course of a lifetime. So I just think it's interesting that stories, they may have been what saved us, because that, a story is the quickest way to create a bond. And if you're a caveman and everyone around you is a stranger, you may want to share a story of how you got away from a saber-toothed tiger. And the way you're going to do that is by pointing on the cave drawing that you had. But what you're doing is you're creating a bond on these basic human elements that we can all relate to. And it's just interesting how, you can go back 2,100 years and, read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a lot of the elements from those stories occur in stories that were written 21 minutes ago.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of different thoughts on that. I think there's a lot of different ways to go. I think, our affinity for stories and for narrative structure is really one of the key things that makes us human. It tells us what we need to place value on, and I think it helps us transcend our animal instincts. You mentioned in episode 3 that a dog is really just living moment to moment, right? Animals not only don't have a sense of time, but they also don't have a running narrative in their head. And I think the stories we tell ourselves in that narrative structure is what allows humans to order their past, both their own and the past of their tribe. It allows them to order their collective history, allows them to order their desires, it allows them to order their morality. And without that affinity for narrative structure, I think we would be a much more moment-to-moment species, a much more probably hedonistic species. We'd be a much more rudderless species, not thinking about where we've been or where we're going. And ultimately, I think we'd be a much more boring species, because I think stories are really one of the most gripping things we have in the human experience. I kind of want to talk more about stories as an ordering force in the world, because I have been reading a lot about stories from a lot of different disciplines, and honestly I don't think we fully understand why stories are so powerful. We know they're lighting up all these different parts of our brain, but it's kind of the same situation with love. Like we can measure the internal analog in the brain of love that's happening in our exterior consciousness, but we still don't really understand why it's such a transcendent experience. And I think it's the same thing with stories. We can see all these different parts of the brain lighting up, but we don't fully understand why it's a great story is a near kind of spiritual experience. And I think that element of stories bringing order to life is really, really a crucial part of it. And I think in order to make that argument, you first have to kind of conceive of order as the kind of bedrock of human flourishing. Order, I think for a lot of people may read as sort of stiff and rigid, but I think of order to chaos as the difference between civilization and anarchy. It's the difference between having a self-identity and being in a state of psychosis. It's the difference between having a moral belief system and having devolved into nihilism. It's the difference between life just being an incomprehensible barrage of sensory inputs and actually seeing the world in terms of information. Information itself is a matter of ordering the world. And
so do you think that that's what led to myths and traditions and legends? Like if you think about Native American stories, do you think that because of their nomadic type of lifestyle, they needed to create some sort of order, so they started to put legends together?
I totally think so. Yeah, I think that they were, they didn't have the ability to empirically measure the world with science in the way that we do. And I think we talked about in one of the episodes too, language is only a few thousand years old. Writing is only a few thousand years old. So really all they had were stories and the oral languages they were using to pass down these stories. And I think coming into the world unsure of what this all is, you get raised on the veldt. They were still in a situation where when the sun went down at night, the sky was alit with these stars that they didn't even know quite what they were. I mean, it probably was a much more mystical and mysterious experience than it is now. And I think myths and stories were a huge part of them making sense of what they were seeing and creating something that they could pass down to the next generation to help them make sense of it as well.
So I think we're getting to the crux of what makes stories so powerful then, because it really is about that connection to each other. Like if you don't know anything else and you just have to create a connection to the next person, that's pretty powerful. And then there has to be, in my opinion, some sort of element of a universal energy that's at play as well. But maybe that's what makes the story so powerful, is just that ability to connect each other.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, I think that I agree with your comments around it being connected to something sort of spiritual and like metaphysical and something that transcends, the single individual. And I know everyone might not agree with me, but I'm gonna take a risk and go down this sort of this path of thinking. But Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychoanalyst, had the idea that people don't have ideas; ideas have people. And what he meant by that is, ideas.
That's
as
deep,
you,
man.
yeah, as you mentioned, stories can leap across generations. Stories, you don't know what idea or what story you're going to inherit by virtue of the culture that you're born into, and you don't really plan to be the person that passes that story, that idea, along to the next generation. That's just sort of the circumstances of your life, and in some situations it works really well, because great ideas, like democracy and liberalism, can be passed down generation to generation and outlive the original person that had that idea or that story in their head. But it's also kind of terrifying, because it means bad stories or bad ideas can get passed down generation to generation, outlive the monster that originally conceived them.
That might be the fine line that we're in right now, because like we're in a tech world. So one of the best things about technology is that it's allowing us to experience the entire storytelling experience, where you can share pictures, you can share videos, you can share your blog. So you have pictures, words, video. So you're getting the full experience, but at the same time, you don't know what you're seeing. Is it true or fake? So in terms of you saying that, hey, it just might be a matter of your circumstances. Well, we live in a tech era that allows us to have all of this at our fingertips, but then with that, you're opening up the bag of fake versus not fake. And just one thing to kind of pull this all together is that if you look at the history of storytelling, it goes from caves, then it goes to the word of mouth, where you get the generation to generation transfers of oral traditions. Then that became narratives with the evolution of words. Interestingly enough, it seems like we've come full circle in a social media world where we're back to telling stories with our pictures.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And it's to your point, about the kind of precarious situation we're in. It's so easy to share these pictures now, and I imagine 2,000 years ago, there was only so much real estate on like cave walls, and like whoever got to be the one that painted that picture, that story in imagistic form, was probably like the tribe leader, or I don't know, I'm imagining they had some sort of prestigious position in the tribe. But now anyone has the ability to send that story out, however harmful it may be. And in one sense, it's great because it's democratized storytelling, and everyone now has the opportunity to do it. But at the same time, it presents people with bad ideas or bad stories to tell the forum to share them as well. So it's a double-edged sword.
All right, well, let's put a wrap on this episode. Thank you once again for tuning in. Please subscribe and rate us 5 stars. We would sincerely appreciate that. And we look forward to catching you next week.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Rising Laterally. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and were able to walk away with some new thinking that could help you in your personal or professional growth. Please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. And if you know of someone who could benefit from this episode, we'd love for you to pass it along. See you next week.